It was a day I will never forget, my mother's funeral. Amid the mournful atmosphere, my father appeared, holding hands with his mistress as if she were his lawful wife. When I couldn't hold back and stood up to protest, she sneered and called me trash, a useless leech. I shot back, calling her the witch who had destroyed my family. And then, a slap that felt like it tore my soul apart landed on my face. My father, the man who had once taught me to live with integrity, took his mistress's side, kicked me out of the funeral, and forbade me from seeing my mother one last time. From that moment on, I swore I would never forget, never forgive. My name is Charles Beckwith. Now at 35 years old, I sit here in a seaside house in Gulfport, Mississippi, gazing out at the vast ocean, and I've decided to tell my life story. Not to complain, but to remind myself that from the ashes of tragedy, a person can still rise. But first, let me take you back to the past, where it all began, where happiness was once real and where pain swept in like an unexpected storm. I was born in Madison, Wisconsin on a chilly autumn morning in 1990. My family was comfortably middle class, not ostentatiously wealthy, but well off enough for life to flow smoothly. My father, George Beckwith, was a mechanical engineer working for a large machinery manufacturing company on the outskirts of the city. He was tall, with a warm, deep voice and a smile that put everyone around him at ease. My mother, Annabelle Beckwith, was an elementary school teacher, the kindest woman I've ever known. She had long brown hair, sparkling blue eyes, and a way of holding me close every night before bed that made me feel like the world was full of only good things. My childhood years were a string of flawless, happy days. Our house was in a peaceful neighborhood with a spacious backyard where I'd run and play with the neighborhood kids. Every morning, my mother would wake up early to prepare breakfast. Toast with peanut butter, warm milk, and a kiss on my cheek before I dashed off to school. My father often came home a bit late, but he always made time on weekends to take me fishing at Lake Mendota. "Son, life is like this fishing rod," he'd say, his warm voice resonating in my ears. "You have to be patient, but when the opportunity comes, you grab it tight." I admired my father so much. He was my role model, strong, responsible, and always teaching me to live uprightly, to never hurt others. My mother was the soul of our home. She didn't just teach me multiplication tables or how to write neatly. She taught me about love. Every night she read me stories, tales of brave knights, of friendships that overcame hardship. "Charles, you must remember," she'd whisper. "Family is where you return to no matter where life takes you." We had family picnics in the summer, laughing by the river, and cozy Christmases with a twinkling tree. I can still recall the smell of my mother's freshly baked cookies wafting through the house, my father's laughter as he shared funny stories from work. That was home, a place I thought would last forever. But life doesn't always go as we wish. As I grew older, cracks began to appear, though at first they were so small I didn't notice. I went to Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, not too far from home, majoring in business. At 23, I was in my final year, preparing to graduate with decent grades. Student life was busy, assignments, parties, and a girlfriend named Allison Young, whom I met in an economics class. Allison, she was a ray of light in my tiring days, with a radiant smile and a way of listening that made me feel understood. But every time I came home to visit, I started to notice changes. My father began coming home later, more frequently. Strange phone calls came at night, and my mother grew quieter. She still smiled at me, still cooked my favorite meals, but her eyes no longer sparkled. They were red, tired, as if she were carrying a burden she couldn't share. I asked, but she'd only shake her head. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just a bit tired." My father brushed it off, always busy with work. I thought it was just the stress of life, that things would be okay. But then, one spring afternoon that year, when I came home early to surprise my mother, I witnessed a scene that made my heart stop. I pushed the door open, calling, "Mom, I'm home." But there was no response. Whispers from the living room drew me there, and then I saw it. My father embracing a strange woman on the sofa. Her, Lorraine Shaw, as I later learned, blonde hair, heavy makeup, and a smug smile. My father flinched, pushed her away, stammering, "Charles, you're back early?" My mother emerged from the kitchen, her face pale, but she said nothing, only turned away to wipe her tears. That was the first time I learned of my father's affair. It wasn't a secret, it was blatant, as if he no longer cared to hide it. From then on, hell began. My father didn't stop. He continued seeing Lorraine, even bringing her to our house a few times, as if challenging my mother. My mother suffered terribly. She cried silently in her bedroom, ate irregularly, and sometimes I overheard heated arguments over the phone when I called home. "George, how could you do this to me, to our son?" she screamed in one call I happened to overhear. My father, coldly, "Annabelle, life is short. I just want to live for myself." I tried to comfort my mother, hugging her when I visited, but she'd only shake her head. "Don't worry, I'll be fine." But she wasn't fine. The pain was eating her from the inside. The tension escalated day by day. I remember my mother's calls, her trembling voice. "Charles, your father came home late again. I don't know what to do." I urged her to talk to him openly, but my father grew more distant. He became bolder, even bragging about Lorraine to his friends. My mother endured, but her limits were reached. One late night after I'd just finished my final exams, she called, her voice faint. "Son, I'm so tired. Your father, he says he wants a divorce." I comforted her, promising to come home the next morning. But that night, the final argument happened. The next morning, the phone rang. It was my father, his voice panicked. "Charles, your mother, she's been in an accident." My heart plummeted. She had driven out after a fierce argument with my father, an argument I later learned about him wanting to move Lorraine into our home. My mother drove in tears, and then her car crashed into a bus on the familiar road leading out of Madison. She was gone instantly without a goodbye. I raced home, tears blurring my vision on the highway, wondering why life could be so cruel. My father had betrayed her, and now she was gone. The funeral was held 3 days later at the small church where my mother used to pray. A mournful atmosphere enveloped everything, with relatives from afar gathering, all grieving for my mother, a kind woman so unfairly treated by life. I stood there trying to suppress my pain, handling the arrangements because my father seemed to have no strength left. But then, as my mother's coffin was brought in, my father appeared, not alone. He was holding hands with Lorraine, who was dressed in black but with garish makeup, as if she were attending a party, not a funeral. Relatives whispered, their eyes filled with shock and indignation. I felt the blood rush to my head like a fire burning in my chest. I stood frozen beside the old wooden pews of the church, my hands gripping the edge of my suit jacket, trying to breathe to stay calm. The heavy scent of white lilies filled the air, mingling with the murmurs of prayers and the soft sobs of Aunt Mary, my mother's cousin, seated in the front row. My mother's oak coffin lay in the center, adorned with white flowers, her favorite color. I had chosen each flower that morning, carefully placing them as she had once carefully cared for me. But now, seeing my father walk in hand with Lorraine, everything inside me collapsed. My father wore a black suit, but the smile on his lips sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't the smile of a husband who had lost his wife, nor the pain of a father bidding farewell to his son's mother. It was the smile of a man living in his own world, beside the woman I despised to my core. Lorraine, with her glossy blonde curls, bright red lips, and tight black dress, walked as if she were the center of attention. She held my father's hand, head held high, her eyes scanning the crowd with unmasked smugness. I heard Aunt Mary whisper, "My God, what's wrong with George? Bringing that woman here?" Another relative shook their head. "No shame at all." I tried to restrain myself, telling myself this was my mother's funeral, that I had to preserve her dignity. But with every step my father and Lorraine took closer to the coffin, my heart pounded harder, as if it might explode. I turned to my father, my voice trembling. "Dad, What are you doing?" He stopped, looked at me, his eyes colder than I'd ever seen. "Lorraine came to pay her respects, son," he said, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. "She's my friend." Friend? The word stabbed my chest like a knife. My mother had just passed, her pain still etched in every corner of our home. And there stood Lorraine, smiling as if she had a right to be there. I couldn't take it anymore. Blood rushed to my head, and I stepped forward, blocking their path, my voice louder than I intended. "She has no right to be here. She's the one who destroyed our family." The church fell silent. The whispers stopped, and all eyes turned to me. Lorraine raised an eyebrow, a smirk spreading across her face. "Oh, the little freeloading student," she said, her voice shrill and sharp as a blade. "Who do you think you are, raising your voice? A useless piece of trash living off your father's money?" Her words were like pouring fuel on a fire. My face burned, my hands trembling with rage. "You're a witch!" I shouted, pointing straight at her face. "You stole my father, indirectly killed my mother. You don't deserve to stand here." My shout echoed through the church's still air. People were stunned. Some covered their mouths, but no one dared speak. Lorraine let out a loud, piercing laugh, as if I'd just told a joke. But my father who had taught me how to tie my shoes, who had held me when I fell off my bike, stepped forward, his face red with anger. "Enough, Charles!" he roared, his voice like thunder. And then, before I could react, his hand swung up. A sharp slap landed on my cheek, the sound ringing out harshly as if tearing the air apart. My head tilted to one side, my cheek burning, and my soul felt like it had been ripped in two. "You ungrateful, disrespectful brat!" my father growled, his eyes blazing. "How dare you speak like that? Get out of here now! You don't deserve to see your mother one last time." I stood there, stunned, feeling like the world was crumbling around me. The crowd was silent. No one dared intervene. Aunt Mary stood up, trying to approach, but someone held her back. Lorraine stood behind my father, arms crossed, a triumphant smile on her lips. I looked into my father's eyes, searching for a trace of the man who had once loved me. But it was gone. There was only coldness and distance. I wanted to scream, to lunge at him, to wipe the smug smile off Lorraine's face, but I couldn't. Not out of fear, but for my mother. This was her day, and I didn't want to tarnish her memory with a brawl. I turned to the coffin where my mother lay, cold and alone. "Mom," I whispered in my mind, tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry." I wanted to kneel, to touch her hand one last time, but my father's gaze was like an invisible wall stopping me. "Go, Charles," he said, his voice low but icy. "You don't belong here anymore." I turned and walked out of the church, each step heavy as lead. Aunt Mary's sobs, the relatives' whispers, and Lorraine's faint chuckle followed me like a shadow. I don't know how far I walked, only that when I stopped, I was standing by Lake Mendota, where my father used to take me fishing. The cold wind blew, blurring the tears on my face. I sat on the grass, hugging my knees, and cried. I cried for my mother, for the happy family we once had, and for myself. A son abandoned by his father on the most painful day of his life. From that moment, everything changed. I returned to my dorm at Northwestern, trying to focus on my final exams, but my mind was trapped in that church, in that slap, in my father's cold eyes. Allison, my girlfriend, was the only one there for me. She listened as I poured out my story, never judging, just quietly holding my hand. "Charles, you're not alone," she said softly. "You have me. I'll always be here for you. Be strong." But despite her comfort, the pain inside me didn't fade. I swore to myself I would never forgive my father, and I would live well, not to prove anything to him, but so that my mother, wherever she was, could smile. A few weeks later, I graduated. The ceremony should have been a joyful day, but I didn't invite my father. He didn't reach out either. I heard from Aunt Mary that he had moved out of our house, living with Lorraine in a luxurious apartment in downtown Madison. Just 3 months after the funeral, they got married. A small wedding, but enough to stir up the relatives. "George has lost his mind," Aunt Mary said over the phone, her voice bitter. He married that woman as if Annabelle never existed. I didn't respond, just quietly hung up. I didn't want to hear more about my father, Lorraine, or anything related to them. I cut off all contact with my father. No calls, no texts, no meetings. He didn't try to find me either. Perhaps he thought I'd calm down, that I'd come back to apologize, but he was wrong. That slap didn't just sting my cheek. It broke the last thread between father and son. I told myself that from now on I would live for myself, for my mother, and for those who truly loved me. But deep down, I knew that scar would never heal. It would follow me, reminding me of the day I lost my mother and the father I once admired. I packed my things and left Evanston, starting a new journey. Allison, who had stood by me through those dark days, became my guiding light. She suggested I move to Gulfport, Mississippi, where her family lived. "You need a fresh start, Charles," she said, her eyes full of trust. "Come there, and we'll build anew together." I agreed, not because I was ready, but because I had nothing left to hold on to except her. I carried my pain, my memories of my mother, and my vow that I wouldn't let my father and Lorraine define my life. As the bus left Wisconsin, I looked out the window at the endless wheat fields. I thought of my mother, her smile, and promised myself, "Mom, I'll live well. I'll make you proud." But deep inside, I knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. That slap, that day, had changed me forever, and I would have to learn to live with it, one day at a time. The bus rolled steadily, its engine humming like a melancholic lullaby. I sat in the back row, a small suitcase at my feet containing a few clothes, my freshly earned Northwestern diploma, and an old family photo, my mother, father, and me, taken during a summer picnic when I was 10. My mother was beaming. My father had his arm around her, and I was holding a bright red kite. It was the last memory of a complete family before everything fell apart. I gently traced my fingers over the photo, a sharp pain piercing my chest. From now on, it was just me and Allison, the only light left in my darkened world. I arrived in Gulfport, Mississippi on a swelteringly unbearable summer afternoon in 2013, the air thick with the salty scent of the sea. Allison was waiting for me at the bus station, her smile like a cool breeze in the oppressive heat. "Welcome to Gulfport, love," she said, hugging me tightly. I tried to smile, but it came out crooked. She took my hand, pulled my suitcase, and led me to her small apartment on the outskirts of the city. "I know you're hurting," she whispered as we sat on the worn-out sofa in her living room. "But you don't have to be strong alone. I'm here, and my family will be here for you too." Her words were like a soothing balm, but the pain of losing my mother and my father's betrayal still smoldered like a wound that refused to close. Allison's family, Walter and Donna Young, welcomed me like their own son. They lived in a white wooden house by the coast with a porch adorned with bougainvillea and the constant sound of waves crashing nearby. Walter, a retired ship captain, had a deep, resonant voice and kind eyes. Donna, a seamstress, was always busy with fabric but never forgot to ask, "Charles, have you eaten enough? Want more cornbread?" Their warmth reminded me of my mother, of our family dinners in Madison, but it also eased my loneliness. They didn't pry about my father or what had happened, but I knew they understood. Allison had told them, and their eyes looked at me with compassion, as if saying, "Son, we'll be your family now." But life in Gulfport wasn't as easy as I'd hoped. I started working at a small real estate brokerage, hoping to put my business degree to use. The job was tougher than I expected. The coastal real estate market was fiercely competitive, and clients were skeptical of a 23-year-old fresh out of college. I was often rejected. My calls went unanswered, and deals slipped through my fingers. Some nights I lay awake, questioning whether I had the strength to keep going. The pain of losing my mother and my father's betrayal loomed like a shadow, always ready to pull me down. In those moments, memories of my mother kept me grounded. I remembered her smile, her gentle voice reading me bedtime stories, and the times she held my hand saying, "Charles, you're stronger than you think." I kept the family photo on my desk, looking into her eyes whenever I felt like giving up. "Mom, I can't let you down," I whispered, as if she could still hear me. Allison was my other pillar of strength. She worked at a small law office, always busy but never too busy to call and ask, "How's your day, love? Need me to bring you coffee?" She believed in me, even when I doubted myself. But I wasn't always strong. Some nights I dreamed of my mother. In my dreams, she stood by Lake Mendota, her hair blowing in the wind, calling my name. I'd run to her, but before I could reach her, I'd see my father and Lorraine laughing triumphantly, pulling her away. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. Those dreams reminded me of the slap at the funeral, of my father's cold eyes. I heard nothing from him in those 12 years. Aunt Mary occasionally called, saying my father was living happily with Lorraine, now Mrs. Beckwith, in a luxurious apartment in Madison. They had a new life, as if my mother and I had never existed. Each time I heard this, I'd nod, hang up, and try to push those memories out of my mind. Still, I refused to let myself drown in sorrow. I learned to stand up, one step at a time. After 6 months of work, I landed my first clients, an elderly couple looking for a beachside vacation home. I won them over with sincerity. That first deal was like a ray of light. I remember holding the commission check, modest but meaningful, and taking Allison out to a small seafood restaurant. "I did it, Allison," I said, trying to hide my overwhelming joy. She smiled, squeezing my hand. "I knew you would." From then on, I threw myself into work as a way to prove myself. I learned how to negotiate, read clients' minds, and turn empty plots into their dreams. I worked day and night, sometimes falling asleep at my desk amid piles of paperwork. There were failures, a big deal canceled at the last minute, a client turning away because of my inexperience. But each time I fell, I remembered my mother's words. "Family is where you return to, no matter where life takes you." Now my family was Allison, Walter, and Donna, people who never turned their backs on me. By 2018, after 5 years of relentless work, I started making a name for myself in the industry. I was promoted to regional manager, overseeing a small team of brokers. My salary increased, and I moved out of a run-down rented apartment into a small but tidy one near the beach. Allison and I began talking about the future. "I want to marry you," I said one evening as we walked along the shore. She laughed, her eyes sparkling under the moonlight. "Then propose to me, Charles Beckwith." I didn't have a ring, nothing but a promise, but she said yes. We got engaged in a simple evening with Walter, Donna, and a bottle of cheap wine. But to me, it was the happiest moment since my mother's passing. We married a year later in a small ceremony in the Youngs' backyard. Allison wore a simple white dress, her hair pinned up, looking like an angel. As I stood there watching her walk toward me, I felt for the first time in years that I wasn't alone. Walter placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Son, you found a new family. Don't let the past hold you back." I nodded, but deep inside I still heard the echo of that slap, my father's cold gaze. Life went on. Allison and I worked hard, saving every penny. I began investing in real estate, buying small plots, renovating and reselling them. My career stabilized, and I felt proud. But deep down, I knew I still carried a scar. Every time I drove past fields, I thought of Wisconsin, of my mother, and wondered about my father. I didn't reach out, didn't call, didn't want to know. But sometimes I wondered, did he ever regret it? Did he ever think of me, of my mother? The years in Gulfport taught me that life waits for no one. Pain may linger, but if you don't move forward, it will swallow you whole. I resolved not to let myself be consumed. Every morning I woke up at 5, brewed coffee, and sat at the table with stacks of papers and contracts. Real estate brokerage wasn't always as glamorous as it appeared on TV. There were days I drove for hours under the scorching sun, showing clients sandy, mosquito-infested plots, only to hear, "We'll think about it." Some nights I sat calculating expenses, worrying about bank loans, wondering if I was on the right path. But each small success brought me closer to the promise I made to my mother, to live well, live kindly, and make her proud. Allison was my indispensable companion. She wasn't just my wife, but also my friend, my mentor, and sometimes the one who pulled me out of my brooding. She still worked at the law office, now promoted to paralegal, her desk buried in papers, but her smile never fading. "Charles, you worry too much," she'd say, resting her hand on my shoulder when I sat frozen in front of my computer screen. "We're doing fine. Just take it easy, everything will be okay." And she was right. We'd weathered the toughest days together, from those early months in Gulfport when I was nearly penniless to the small arguments sparked by work stress. But after each one, we held hands tighter. In 2020, a major turning point came. An old client, Mr. Thompson, a seasoned real estate investor, called and offered a partnership. He wanted me to join a big project, developing a small beachfront resort with condos overlooking the Gulf of Mexico. "You've got an eye for this, Charles," he said over the phone, his voice low and steady. "You don't just sell land, you sell dreams. I need someone like you." His offer was like a fresh breeze. I agreed, knowing it was a huge gamble. The project required all my savings, time, and dedication. But I saw an opportunity, and as the father who had caused so much pain to my mother and me once said, "When the opportunity comes, you grab it tight." The project spanned 2 years, filled with challenges. I worked with contractors, architects, and local officials to secure permits. There were moments I thought I'd break. A contractor quit midway, a bank loan was denied, and summer storms delayed progress. But I didn't give up. I remembered my mother, her eyes when she said, "You're stronger than you think." I recalled my early days in Gulfport with only Allison and fragile hope, and I held on to my promise to myself. I wouldn't let the past define my future. In 2022, the resort was completed. On the opening day, I stood on the balcony of a model condo, gazing at the sea sparkling under the sun. The first families had moved in, children's laughter echoing from the beach. Mr. Thompson shook my hand, a rare smile breaking across his weathered face. "You did great, Charles. I didn't choose the wrong guy." I smiled, but inside I wanted to shout with joy. I called Allison, my voice trembling. "Babe, we did it." She laughed loudly over the phone. "You did it, Charles. I knew you would." The project's success brought more than money. It was a milestone. Allison and I used the profits to put a down payment on a beachfront house, not a rented apartment, but a real home of our own. It was a small, cozy white wooden house with a porch overlooking the Gulf. The day we signed the contract, I stood in front of the house, keys in hand, feeling like I'd conquered the world. Allison hugged me from behind, whispering, "This is our home, Charles. For you, me, and the kids." Yes, the kids. We had 2 little angels, Julian, 3 years old with blue eyes like my mother's, and Scarlett, just one, giggling whenever I held her. Moving day was unforgettable. We threw a small party, inviting the Youngs, a few close friends, and even Mr. Thompson. The front lawn buzzed with laughter, the smell of barbecue wafting through the air, and Julian ran around with a little ball. Donna brought a tray of homemade cornbread, and Walter told stories of his days as a ship captain, making everyone double over with laughter. Allison stood beside me, her hand in mine, and said, "See, Charles? This is our family. This is where we belong." I nodded, tears welling up. For the first time in 12 years, I felt I truly had a home. But even in my happiest moments, the scar of the past still ached. Some nights when the house was quiet, I sat on the porch listening to the waves and thought of my mother. I imagined her standing here smiling at me, proud that I hadn't given up. But then images of my father and Lorraine crept in like a thorn in my heart. I didn't know where they were or how they were living. Aunt Mary had long stopped talking about them, only saying my father was doing fine without elaborating. I told myself I didn't care, but sometimes I wondered, did he ever think of me? Did he regret that slap, choosing Lorraine over his own son? I tried to push those thoughts away, focusing on the present. Julian and Scarlett were my greatest joy. Julian loved following me around the house, asking endless questions. "Daddy, does the sea ever sleep?" Scarlett loved nestling in my arms, grabbing my finger and giggling. Looking at them, I saw my mother in them, her gentleness, her strength. I wanted to be the father she'd hoped I'd have, not the one who betrayed me. Every night I told Julian bedtime stories, just as my mother had done for me. Once upon a time, there was a brave, kind little knight. I'd begin, and he'd listen intently, his eyes shining. Allison and I kept building our life. We expanded our investments, buying more small plots, and I started consulting for new investors. Work was no longer a burden, but a passion. I loved helping others turn their dreams into reality, just as I had done for myself. Our beachfront house became a symbol of independence, of the years spent fighting to stand tall. Every time I looked at it, I remembered the hard days and told myself I made it. But life, as I'd learned, never lets you rest too long. Just when I thought I'd found peace, a shadow from the past loomed, threatening to upend everything. My father, the man I thought was gone forever, was about to re-enter my life, bringing Lorraine in a past I'd tried to bury. I didn't know it was coming, but deep inside I sensed a storm approaching, ready to test everything I'd built. It was an early summer afternoon in 2025, the Gulfport sky clear and blue, a gentle sea breeze drifting through our porch. Julian was playing with building blocks on the rug while Scarlett slept soundly in her crib, her cheeks rosy and plump. Allison was in the kitchen preparing dinner, the aroma of fried fish and cornbread filling the house. I sat in an armchair reviewing a real estate contract, feeling content with our steadily stabilizing life. Our beachfront house, though small, was the fruit of years of sweat and tears. Every brick, every window frame bore the mark of Allison and me. I thought I had found a place to heal, a place where I could be a father, a husband, and myself. The doorbell rang, shattering the peaceful atmosphere. I frowned, not expecting anyone at this hour. Allison poked her head out from the kitchen, asking, "Honey, who's that?" I shook my head, stood up, and went to open the door. When it swung open, my heart seemed to stop. Standing before me was my father, George Beckwith, his hair now streaked with silver, his face more gaunt than I remembered, but still unmistakably him, with the eyes I once admired and now only stirred pain. Beside him was Lorraine, her blonde curls and bright red lipstick unchanged, though time had etched wrinkles onto her face. They stood there like a portrait from the past, making me step back, my hand gripping the doorframe tightly. "Charles," my father said, his voice hoarse, forcing a smile. "It's been a long time, son." I was stunned, unable to believe my eyes. 12 years, no calls, no messages, no inquiries. And now he was here at my doorstep calling me son. Lorraine looked me over, her eyes appraising, then smirked. "Oh, Charles, you look well. Nice house. Must have cost a fortune, huh?" Her voice dripped with fake sweetness, as if we were old friends. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "What are you doing here, Dad?" I asked, my voice cold. Allison appeared behind me, placing a hand on my shoulder, her eyes full of concern. My father glanced at Allison, then back at me, saying, "We're family, Charles. I wanted to see you, to see how you're doing." I almost laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. Family? Since when did he consider me family? Since the slap at my mother's funeral? Since he chose Lorraine and erased my mother's memory? Lorraine chimed in, her voice shrill. "Charles, aren't you going to invite us in? It was a long trip and we're tired. We'd also love to meet our grandchildren." She emphasized grandchildren, as if she had any claim to Julian and Scarlett. I felt my blood boil, but Allison squeezed my hand lightly, reminding me to stay calm. "Come in," I said, my voice dry, opening the door wider. I didn't want them here, but I also didn't want to make a scene in front of the kids. They stepped inside, Lorraine scanning the house, her eyes seeming to appraise every item. "Lovely place," she said, touching a painting on the wall. The one my mother had painted, her final gift to me. I clenched my teeth, resisting the urge to snatch it from her hands. My father sat on the sofa, sighing as if he were the most exhausted man in the world. "Son, I know things in the past weren't great, he began, his voice low. But things are different now. Lorraine and we're going through some tough times. I thought we could stay here for a while to be closer to you. I was floored, as if someone had punched me in the gut. Stay here? In my house? The house Allison and I had poured our sweat and tears into building? I looked at my father, searching for a sign that he was joking, but his eyes were serious, though tinged with awkwardness. Lorraine jumped in. Just for a bit, Charles. We're a little strapped for cash. You're his son. Helping your parents is only natural, right? She smiled, a smile that made my stomach churn. I turned to Allison, seeing her face pale. Julian, sensing the tension, ran to cling to his mother's leg. Scarlett started crying in her crib. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. Dad, I said, my voice trembling with anger. You abandoned me for 12 years. Not a single word. And now you show up expecting to stay in my house like nothing happened? My father lowered his head, mumbling, Charles, I was wrong. But I'm your father. We're blood. Blood. The word cut like a knife. I remembered the slap at the funeral, his cold eyes as he kicked me out of the church. I remembered my mother lying in her coffin while he held Lorraine's hand and smiled. Blood doesn't mean anything when you chose her over Mom and me, I said, my voice low but sharp. Lorraine laughed. Oh, you're still bitter about the past? Grow up, Charles. If it weren't for your father paying for your education, you wouldn't be where you are today. Her words were like pouring fuel on a fire. I wanted to scream, to throw them out of my house right then and there. But Allison gripped my hand, whispering, Charles, stay calm. Don't let them ruin everything. I looked into her eyes, seeing the strength I'd always leaned on. Fine, I said, turning back to my father. You can stay here, but only for 2 weeks. After that, I want you gone. My father nodded, looking relieved, while Lorraine shrugged as if she'd expected me to give in. I didn't know if I'd made the right decision, but I knew one thing. The storm had arrived, and it wouldn't pass easily. 2 weeks. I thought I could endure 2 weeks, but I was wrong. My father and Lorraine turned my home into a battlefield where every cherished memory was violated and the happiness of my family was threatened. From the very first day, they acted like they owned the place. Lorraine rummaged through the kitchen cabinets, criticizing Allison's cooking. Fried fish like this? We do it better in Wisconsin. My father plopped himself in the armchair, blasting the TV with sports programs Allison and I never watched. They made demands, gave orders, and showed no gratitude. Julian, my usually lively son, became timid. He clung to Allison whenever Lorraine was near, his eyes filled with fear. Scarlett, barely over a year old, cried more than usual, as if sensing the tension in the air. Allison tried to keep the peace, but I could see her exhaustion. Charles, I don't know how much longer I can handle this, she whispered one night as we lay in bed, listening to my father's snoring from the living room. They don't respect us, don't respect this house. I knew she was right, but I kept trying to endure, hoping the 2 weeks would pass quickly. Yet each day, my father and Lorraine's presence cut deeper into my old scars. My father constantly brought up the past as if to justify himself. Charles, if it weren't for me, you wouldn't have gone to Northwestern, he said once when I refused to buy the expensive liquor he demanded. Lorraine mocked me. You're living like this because of your father, so don't act high and mighty. I clenched my teeth, trying not to respond, but their every word felt like a punch. The breaking point came one evening when Allison was preparing dinner for the family. Lorraine sauntered into the kitchen, helping herself to a bottle of wine from the cabinet. The bottle Walter had given us for our wedding anniversary. You're so stingy, Charles, she said, pouring it into a glass. Living in a nice house like this and you're skimping on a bottle of wine? Allison, who had always been patient, finally snapped, You have no right to touch our things. Lorraine laughed loudly. Oh, the little wife's getting mad. Charles, teach your wife some manners. I stood up, grabbed Allison's hand and said, Enough. You're staying in our house. Stop acting like you own it. My father, sitting at the dining table, roared, Charles, how dare you talk to us like that? Ungrateful brat. The word ungrateful hit like another slap, bringing back that day in the church. I looked at him, my heart pounding. You have no right to call me that, I said, my voice trembling with anger. You abandoned me, abandoned Mom, and now you want to ruin my family too? The air was taut as a bowstring. Lorraine stood, pointing at me. You should be grateful for your father, you arrogant little punk. I stood there in my own home, feeling like a stranger. Julian clung tightly to Allison's leg, his eyes wide with fear. Scarlett wailed in her crib, her cries cutting into my heart like a knife. Allison gripped my hand, her eyes resolute, though I knew she was holding back her own emotions. Enough, I said, my voice low but sharp. You're here because I allowed it, but don't think you can order us around. Lorraine smirked and my father shook his head, muttering something about disrespectful kids. I turned away, pulling Allison and Julian out of the dining room, trying to keep my heart from shattering. But that was just the beginning. In the days that followed, the home Allison and I had built with sweat and tears became a war zone. My father and Lorraine acted as if they owned everything. Lorraine rummaged through the kitchen, taking food without asking, even throwing out soup Allison had made because it didn't suit her taste. My father claimed my favorite armchair, blasting the TV from early morning to late at night. They demanded Allison cook their favorite dishes, asked me to buy expensive liquor, and even complained that the house was too small compared to their luxurious apartment in Madison. Charles, you're making money and living like this? Lorraine said once, her tone dripping with sarcasm. I thought you were a big shot. Julian and Scarlett suffered the most. Julian, who used to run around the yard with his ball, now only dared to play in his bedroom with the door closed. Once, Lorraine scolded him for spilling water on the floor. Clumsy kid, big but no brains, huh? Julian ran to me, tears streaming down his face. I hugged him, trying to comfort him, but inside I was burning with rage. Scarlett cried more often, no longer giggling as she used to. Allison, no matter how patient, was starting to break. Charles, I can't take it anymore, she said one night as we sat on the bed listening to Lorraine's shrill laughter from the living room. They're destroying our family. I knew she was right. Each day my father and Lorraine's presence was like a poison spreading through the house. They didn't just take up physical space, they stole our peace. My father kept bringing up the past as if to assert his authority. You should be grateful for what I gave you instead of turning your back on family, he said, his voice smug. Family? I wanted to scream that he had destroyed our family the day he held Lorraine's hand at my mother's funeral. But I held back, for Julian and Scarlett, for Allison, and for the promise I made to my mother to live kindly. After 5 days, I couldn't take it anymore. On the morning of the 6th day, I took Allison, Julian, and Scarlett to Walter and Donna's house, my in-laws. Stay here for a few days, love, I said, kissing Allison's forehead. I'll handle this. Walter clapped a hand on my shoulder, his eyes stern. Charles, you're the man of your family. Don't let them take what you've built. Donna hugged me, saying, We're always here if you need us, son. Protect your little family no matter what. I nodded, feeling like a knight preparing for battle. When I returned home, I found my father and Lorraine still acting entitled. Lorraine lounged on the sofa, eating cookies from Julian's box while my father rifled through papers on my desk. What are you doing? I shouted, my voice trembling. Lorraine shrugged. Relax, Charles. We're just looking over your stuff. Maybe we can help. I realized then that 2 weeks would never end unless I acted. They had no intention of leaving. They wanted to stay, to control, to turn my home into theirs. But I wasn't the 23-year-old student slapped at a funeral anymore. I was Charles Beckwith, a man who had overcome grief, built a family, and I wouldn't let anyone take that away. Back at the Youngs' house, I felt a renewed sense of determination. Julian was playing with Walter in the backyard, while Scarlett slept soundly in Donna's arms. Allison sat beside me, her eyes filled with worry but also trust. Charles, what's your plan? She asked. I took her hand and said, Don't worry. I'm going to take our home back. I started by calling a reputable lawyer in Gulfport, Mr. Henry Canales. He agreed to meet me that afternoon. In his small but tidy office, I poured out the whole story about my father, Lorraine, the slap at my mother's funeral, and how they were taking over my home. Henry listened, nodding, and then said, "Charles, you have clear legal rights. The house is in your and Allison's name. No one can dispute that. But we need to proceed carefully to avoid long-term trouble." Henry suggested drafting an official notice, demanding that my father and Lorraine leave within 48 hours, or the police would intervene. "They have no right to stay if you don't allow it," he said. "But you need to stay calm. Don't let emotions take over." I nodded, though anger still simmered inside me. I didn't just want them gone. I wanted them to understand they couldn't keep hurting me. I also contacted an old friend, Jordan, a police officer in Gulfport. Jordan listened to my story, shaking his head. "Charles, I can't believe he's your father, but don't worry. If it comes to it, I'll bring backup." With Jordan and Henry's support, I felt more confident. But I knew confronting my father and Lorraine wasn't just a legal matter. It was a mental battle, where I had to prove I was no longer the helpless boy from years ago. 2 days later, I returned home with the legal notice from Henry. My father and Lorraine were still there, acting as if they owned the place. Lorraine was watching TV while my father sat at the dining table drinking coffee from Allison's mug. I took a deep breath, walked in, and placed the notice on the table. "This is an official notice," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You have 48 hours to leave my house. If you don't, the police will get involved." Lorraine laughed as if I'd told a joke. "You'd kick out your own father? That's ridiculous." My father looked at me, his eyes flashing with anger. "Charles, who do you think you are? I'm your father." I met his gaze without flinching. "You lost that right the day you slapped me at Mom's funeral. This is my home, my wife's, my kids. You don't belong here." The air was thick with tension. Lorraine stood, pointing at me. "You'll regret this, Charles. We're your family." I shook my head. "My family is Allison, Julian, and Scarlett. You're just the past." I turned and left the house, leaving them with the notice. I knew they wouldn't leave easily, but I was ready. Exactly 48 hours later, I returned to my house, my heart heavy but resolute. Jordan, my police officer friend, came with me, flanked by 2 colleagues, their expressions stern in their dark blue uniforms. When I pushed open the door, the sight before me made my heart clench. My father and Lorraine were still there, their belongings strewn across the living room. Open suitcases, clothes scattered on the sofa, even an unwashed coffee mug left on Allison's dining table. They had no intention of leaving, as if daring me, daring the law itself. Jordan stepped forward, his voice deep and authoritative. "Mr. and Mrs. Beckwith, I'm ordering you to leave this house immediately. This is the private property of Charles Beckwith, and you have no right to remain." Lorraine flinched, her face paling, but she quickly regained her smug demeanor. She jumped up, her blonde hair disheveled, pointing at Jordan and shouting, "You can't do this, we're family, I'm this kid's stepmother." Her shrill voice echoed in the quiet space, but this time, it didn't faze me. I looked at my father, waiting for him to speak, but he just sat there in my armchair, his eyes vacant, as if his soul had left his body. For the first time, I saw him as frail, no longer the man who had slapped me at my mother's funeral. I stepped forward, placing Henry's legal notice on the table, my voice calm but icy. "Dad, Lorraine, you were warned. This is my house, Allison's, my kids. You have no place here." Lorraine turned to me, her eyes blazing. "You dare, Charles? Kicking out your own father, you ungrateful brat?" But I didn't respond. I just stared into her eyes, then turned to my father, who remained silent, his head bowed. "Dad," I said, my voice low but steady, 12 years ago you kicked me out of Mom's funeral. Now it's my turn to ask you to leave. Fair, isn't it?" The air was suffocatingly heavy. Lorraine began packing, muttering curses under her breath. My father slowly stood, his trembling hands picking up an old suitcase. I noticed how much he'd aged. His shoulders slumped. his face lined with deep wrinkles. A flicker of pity crossed my heart, but then memories of my mother, the slap, and the years of loneliness hardened me again. I owed him nothing. The door opened, golden afternoon sunlight streaming in. Outside, a few neighbors gathered, peering over the fence, whispering to each other. I saw Mrs. Jenkins, who often brought cookies for Julian, shaking her head in regret. Lorraine, dragging her suitcase, turned back and shouted, "You'll regret this, Charles. You'll be alone forever, you ungrateful jerk." Her words rang out, but they didn't touch me. I stood at the door, hands in my pockets, watching them walk to an old pickup truck parked by the road. My father glanced back, his eyes meeting mine for a moment, but he said nothing. He got into the truck, slammed the door, and it drove off, leaving a thin trail of dust on the coastal road. Jordan placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice gentle. "You did the right thing, Charles. They can't stay where they don't belong. Now go back to your real family." I nodded, feeling as if a boulder had been lifted from my chest. I looked back at the house Allison and I had built with sweat and tears. Though it had been invaded, it was still ours, still the place filled with Julian's laughter, Scarlett's babbling, and Allison's love. I drove back to the Young's house, feeling lighter but still tinged with bitterness. When I walked in, Julian ran to me, hugging me tightly. "Daddy, are the old people gone?" I knelt down, ruffled his hair, and smiled. "Yes, buddy. Our house is ours again." Allison stepped out from the kitchen, her eyes bright, though still a bit worried. She hugged me, whispering, "Are you okay, Charles?" I held her tightly, feeling the warmth of the woman who had stood by me through every storm. "I'm okay, love," I said, my voice hoarse. "Thank you for everything." Donna brought Scarlett over, the little girl giggling and reaching for me. I took her in my arms, kissed her cheek, and felt my heart begin to heal. Walter clapped my shoulder, saying, "Son, you protected your family. Your mother up in heaven must be so proud." I nodded, my eyes stinging. Our house, though violated, was still where I belonged. And this time I had won. Not with fists, but with resilience, love, and the justice I knew my mother would smile upon. I returned to our beachfront house the next morning with Allison, Julian, and Scarlett. When I pushed open the door, I almost didn't recognize the familiar space. The smell of stale coffee, stains on the sofa, and the lingering heaviness left by my father and Lorraine still hung in the air. But sunlight streamed through the window, glinting off the painting my mother had made, reminding me that this was still our home. Allison set to cleaning, humming a tune, while Julian ran out to the yard, clutching his ball and laughing as if nothing had happened. Scarlett crawled around the floor, babbling, "Da-da, da-da." I stood there watching my family, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. We had reclaimed our home, not just through legal papers, but through love and unity. But the memories of my father and Lorraine didn't fade easily. The slap at my mother's funeral, my father's cold eyes, and Lorraine's shrill voice still echoed in my mind, especially on quiet nights when I sat on the porch listening to the waves. I didn't hate my father anymore, but I didn't forgive him either. I realized forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing to live so the pain no longer controls you. I had done that, not for my father, but for my mother, for Allison, for my children, and for myself. A week later, I decided to take the family to Madison, Wisconsin to visit my mother's grave. It was my first time back since marrying Allison. The road to the cemetery was unchanged, lined with maple trees ablaze with red leaves under the autumn sun. I held Allison's hand, carried Scarlett while Julian ran ahead, excited about going on an adventure with his parents. Standing before my mother's headstone engraved with Annabelle Beckwith, "Loving mother forever cherished," I felt tears well up. I knelt, placing a bouquet of white lilies, her favorite, on the grave, whispering, "Mom, I did it. I've lived well like you always wanted." Julian, curious, asked, "Daddy, who's this?" I smiled, ruffling his hair. "This is your grandma, the person who loved me most in the world." Allison placed a hand on my shoulder, her eyes gentle. Your mom must be smiling somewhere, Charles. Scarlett reached out, touching the headstone as if sensing the presence of the grandmother she never met. I stood there in the quiet cemetery, feeling as though my mother was close, embracing me like she did when I was a child. On the drive back to Gulfport, I reflected on everything that had passed. My life, from the happy days in Madison through the tragedy of losing my mother and my father's betrayal to my journey of rising up in Gulfport, hadn't been easy. But it taught me invaluable lessons. I learned that family isn't just blood, it's the people who stand by you even when life drags you to the depths. Allison, Julian, Scarlett, Walter, and Donna, they were my true family. My father and Lorraine, though once part of my life, were now just shadows from the past. I also learned that justice isn't revenge. It's protecting what you cherish. When I forced my father and Lorraine out, I didn't feel triumphant, only relieved. I had protected my family not with fists, but with resilience and faith in what was right. Above all, I learned that no scar, no matter how deep, can stop you from living a meaningful life. Every time I watched Julian run around, heard Scarlett's babbling, or felt Allison's warmth beside me, I knew I had overcome the pain. Not by erasing it, but by turning it into motivation. As our car rolled past golden wheat fields, I turned to Allison and said, "Babe, if someone asked me about my life tomorrow, what would I say?" She laughed, her eyes sparkling. "You'd say life is a journey, and what matters is who you choose to walk with, what you choose to protect." I nodded, squeezing her hand. From the back seat, Julian shouted, "Daddy, tell the night story." I laughed, starting, "Once upon a time, there was a brave, kind little knight." As the sunset cast a golden glow over the road ahead, I thought about the advice I'd share with anyone struggling with their past. Cherish those who love you, for they are the fire that warms you through the coldest days. Stand up after every fall, for each scar is proof you survived. And remember, no matter how cruel life may be, you always have the power to choose how to live, with resilience, with love, and with hope. Our beachfront house was once again filled with laughter. Julian and Scarlett played in the yard, Allison prepared dinner, and I sat on the porch gazing at the shimmering sea. I didn't know what the future held, whether my father would ever return or if I could fully let go of the past. But I knew one thing. I had found where I belonged, and I would do everything to protect it. Life, as my mother once said, is where you return no matter where it takes you. And I, Charles Beckwith, had found my way. 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 My way.